not that many people can say that when you think about it, bigger scheme of things. And I like it because it requires some humility. You need to be humble when you're facing the Grizzly. So I often think about that, and I think it just adds another dimension to being outside in this area. And for me, it's an honor, but it also comes with a lot of responsibility for us, and it requires cooperation, it requires respect, as well as some tribulations and some headaches. There's that too. So that's why I'm really, really thrilled that we have the panelists assembled here that we do tonight. And this evening's moderator, Mr. Nick Mott. Nick approached us about doing this, and we wholeheartedly resounding yes, we will. Let's make this happen. This would be a great discussion to have. So a little bit about Nick. Nick is an audio producer, journalist, and author. He co-wrote the book This Is Wildfire, published last year. His print writing has appeared in publications as diverse as The Washington Post, Outside, and Alpinist magazine. You've probably heard him on the radio at one time or another, and podcasts he's written and produced have received some of the highest awards in the field, including 2 National Edward R. Murrow Awards and a Peabody. Most recently, a lot of emotion that come with that we share, a very strong connection with all of our four-legged friends in this area. So I just want to recognize that, and we will open this up to questions in the last half an hour. So if you do have a question or a thought, please hold that till we get to that point, and then we will be running around passing the microphone and be able to invite all of you to join in this dialogue as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Nick.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Max, and thank you everybody for coming. This is really amazing to see everybody come out here on a cold and blustery Wednesday night. And to get started, I want to just do some table setting about grizzlies more generally here, like where we're at and why we're talking about this species. I mean, grizzlies to many people are a symbol, like an icon of wildness and intact ecosystems, and to others they're a threat to lifestyle, to livelihood. And living here, I think everybody in this room has a connection to grizzly bears in one way or another. And that's why I wanted to get this panel together. There's the story of grizzly bears is a remarkable recovery story. So, in the 1970s, there were fewer than 250 bears in the whole Yellowstone region. Most of them were in Yellowstone National Park proper, hanging on by eating trash that was fed to them by park employees for quite a time. And then came federal protections. And we also designated these vast swaths of wilderness, like the Absaroka beartooths in our backyard here. And this allowed the species to expand and recover. Today, there's roughly 1,000 grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and they're showing up in places they haven't been in over a century. It's out on the plains of Montana, out near the Missouri Breaks. People are learning to live with this species that have never had to do so before. And more than anything, living with grizzlies gets beyond the sort of politics and partisanship that goes with conversations about grizzlies at the political level so often. But those conversations are important to have too, because come January, the federal government's likely to make some sort of recommendations over what to do about grizzly management, whether they should stay protected by the Endangered Species Act, both here in the greater Yellowstone area and even up in the glacier area, or if management should go over to the states. And I've assembled this panel here today to talk about all of this. So to start out, I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves. Please just keep it maybe to a couple sentences, and also share one memorable experience you've had with or adjacent to grizzly bears. And we'll just go in order here. Let's start with you, Evan.
My name is Evan Stout, and I live down in Gardiner. I own a small tour company, take people out into the park to see the bears quite often. And I also organize and run Bear Awareness Gardiner. And probably my most formidable grizzly bear memory was the first grizzly bear I ever saw, which was in the Yukon Territory about 20 years ago. And my first sighting rapidly evolved into my first bluff charge. And we all survived and walked away, but it taught me a pretty big lesson about bears.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Servheen. I was the grizzly bear recovery coordinator for 35 years for the Fish and Wildlife Service. I retired in 2016, and I failed at retirement. I am currently the president and board chair of the Montana Wildlife Federation, and I'm co-chair of the North American Bears Expert Team, or IUCN. I have a lot of interest in bears, as you can imagine, and I worked on bears for my PhD in the Mission Mountains, and some of my most magical times with bears are when they don't know I'm there and I'm just watching what they do. And so watching bears eat moths in the alpine, for example, accompanied by a big flock of ravens who are also eating moths with the bears, and watching that happen for hours at a time are some of my special moments with bears.
Hi, I'm Druska, Kinkie. We have a ranch south of town, or north of town, sorry. Anyway, in the Paradise Valley, out by 6 Mile. And we've been there for a long time, 70 plus years. It's a cow-calf operation, and we never ever saw bears. And then, you know, at the end of October, I looked out the kitchen window and there was a big old grizzly bear right by our stackyard. And so, you're right, they're now here and we have to learn to live with them. It's a little shocking sometimes, and there's a whole nother host of issues for ranchers that come with that, and we'll probably get into some of those, but they're a beautiful animal. I love bears. So I just don't want them eating my stuff.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Quentin Kujala. Thanks for coming. Thanks for letting me be here. Looking forward to the conversation. I'm fortunate to be the Chief of Conservation Policy for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I've been with the agency for 30 years, starting with an area management biologist based at Freezeout Lake. My wife and I spent 12 years in Fairfield before we came to Helena through a series of positions. The grizzly moment that I would talk about, a coworker and I were, it was during the fall hunting season. We were in the backcountry on the North Fork of the Sun River. We were visiting camps, having conversations that included bear awareness, how the hunting was going, et cetera, compliance stuff. And there was a sliver of moon, a light snow cover. It was well past dark. We were coming home. The horse I was on, we were second in line. We came around a corner and it was just light enough to not see when you look directly at something, but you could see something through the corner of your eye. And it was abundantly clear at the same precise moment for both my horse and me, and my coworker and his horse, that there was a grizzly bear sitting about 20 yards off the trail. Stood out like a sore thumb. Again, when you look to the periphery, everybody sidestepped. I hung on. Max, it was most humbling, to be very clear. We rode by. Everybody got back on the trail. We went around the next corner, and we went back there the next morning. Our duties weren't done, and it was clear that the bear had been coming toward us up the trail. No doubt heard the heavy footfalls of the horses in their tack. Stepped off the trail. Could have went another 10 yards and been out of sight in some trees, but sat down in the open. You could see where the bear sat. Watched us walk by, and then followed his tracks back to the trail and walked up the trail on us. So it was, again, it was humbling. It was a neat exposure. It was invigorating. It was frightening. I'm super glad the horse didn't decide to freak out. I've often wondered what I would do if I was, because I often did that on foot if the trail was icy and the horses were having trouble, and what I would have done if I had came around the same corner on foot. So it was neat to see the bear very deliberately get out of the way and go back to doing what the bear was doing before we came along. Sorry for the long story, Nick.
It's a great story. Thank you all for your stories. We can all probably listen to grizzly stories all night, but let's talk about other things too, all grizzly related. Evan and Druska, I'd love to start with you two, because you're living literally on the front lines of grizzly expansion and recovery. Evan, you're in Gardiner, where a town that deals with grizzlies in town. And Druska, you told the story of the grizzly out just right near your home. And I'd love to start with you, Druska. Tell us more about how you've experienced the expansion of grizzlies, both like near your house or where you graze and all that comes with it.
So,
Use the microphone.
sorry. So up until the last, 4 to 6 years, we just didn't have grizzly bears around. Our home place is right along the river, and some are up Trail Creek. And so you would think more bears up Trail Creek, but it was black bears. And we just did not have grizzly bears. And that has changed. the grizzly bears moved in, and then you start experiencing loss of your cattle, and you don't know what did it because you can't ever find them, but they're just not there anymore. And so it's hard to know how much the grizzly bears are doing things, and just really hard to figure any of that out. And at home, black bears again, but no grizzly bears. This spring was the first time we've ever had grizzly bears down at the house along the river. And you think twice about where you walk, and I walk all the time, and I pretend like I can sing, and so I'm hoping that's enough that they're at least aware I'm around. And for the most part, I just ignore them at home. But up Trail Creek, where our cows are, it's a whole different ballgame.
Thanks, Druska. Evan, I'd love to hear about your journey into Bear Awareness Gardiner. Like, how did you come to work on helping the community adapt to living with grizzly bears?
Yeah, so my kind of foray into this world has been started a few years ago now, when we were having an exceptionally bad conflict year in town. Later in the fall, depending on what the natural foods are doing up in the mountains, the bears have kind of learned to come down into Gardiner, and there's often food available for them. And so we had a really bad white bark year, and a lot of the bears were coming down into town, and come September, October-ish, on any given night, there could be 5 to 7 individual grizzly bears walking around in town in Gardiner. And meaning, like, if you're all familiar with Gardiner, that's like down Main Street, that's across the bridge, that's in the grocery store parking lot, this is in town. And so I kind of looked around, and being a business owner who depends on bears to make my livelihood, feel a bit of responsibility to the bears. Like, they're my business partners. Without them, my business doesn't work. And so I looked around and said, who's doing anything about this? And the answer was kind of no one. So I found an organization that was already in place, kind of took it by the reins and started doing that work, and it's grown ever since.
And just to quickly sample, what kind of work does that mean?
So Bear Awareness Gardiner has a free bear-proof trash can to every resident. We have an electric fencing loan-out program for apple trees and beehives and chicken coops. We cost share with businesses to get them whatever those solutions are that they need. We've replaced all the grease traps in town to bear-proof ones. We organize volunteers to pick apples in the fall and get all the fruit out of the trees. We've given out almost a couple hundred cans of bear spray over the last 2 years for free to just anybody who might need one. And then a lot of education and outreach.
Wonderful. So it's clear we have an expanding grizzly population, from the bears walking down Main Street in Gardiner to the bears showing up outside Druska's house. The really tricky question, or one of the many tricky questions I should say, is how do we deal with them from a management perspective? Like, from the federal government's perspective, from the states, and that is where we get into all kinds of questions, concerns, debates, and a lot of it centers around the idea of delisting, or removing protections for grizzly bears. This is, the federal government's tried twice in the past to remove protections for Yellowstone area grizzly bears, and Chris, you've been involved in that effort and years ago when you were recovery coordinator, and you went from being, pushing for delisting to now being one of the most vocal proponents against delisting. I'd love to hear about that journey. And please also fill us in on what delisting could actually means.
Okay, make a lot of stuff there. Yes, I was in favor of delisting, and the reason I was is that I worked closely with my colleagues in the state governments and the biologists at the state government level and the Fish and Game departments, and the 3 states were making decisions about the welfare of grizzly bears. We built management plans together. We put regulatory mechanisms together for the future of bears, and I was very confident that those decisions were going to be made by biologists who were really doing the right thing. And since that time, there's been an erosion of biological decision making, and now we have politicians making decisions about wildlife management in general, for wolves, for grizzly bears. And these politicians, when they make decisions about wildlife, they don't really have a decision-making process that involves the welfare of the animals. It's more related to political expediency and what can benefit them politically. And that's what's happening today in the 3 states, primarily Montana and Idaho, where we have politicians deeply involved in the day-to-day management of wildlife and setting rules and policies about how many should be killed and what means should be used to kill them. They put risky factors on the landscape regarding wolves, neck-snaring wolves, trapping wolves with bait, shooting wolves over bait at night with spotlights, hound hunting black bears in grizzly bear habitat with hounds. All these things are high-risk opportunities where grizzly bears are going to get into trouble with people. Grizzly bears are going to die, and in many cases we won't know about them, and the biologists won't know about them, and it'll be very difficult to regulate those mortalities. And so that interference of politicians in the day-to-day management is what changed my mind. And it wasn't that way. For 30 years, as I was the recovery coordinator, biological decisions for the good of grizzly bears were made by biologists, and I had a lot of confidence in those folks doing the right thing at the state level. But that all disappeared when we got politicians in there who superseded the biologists, who told them not to comment, who told them that they were going to put these laws in place, and that's where we are today. So it's a really risky environment for grizzly bears in the Montana landscape and in the Idaho landscape, to some extent in Wyoming. And that's why I've changed my mind. And for grizzlies to be delisted, what we need is we need careful, adequate regulatory mechanisms for mortality, so that the mortalities that occur for grizzly bears are all controlled and tightly monitored, and we know about them all. We have to have adequate regulatory mechanisms for habitat, so that we have commitments from the federal land managers, particularly the Forest Service in the case of grizzly bears, that the lands are going to be managed for the benefit of grizzly bears and not eliminating the concerns about bears. For example, in the Flathead Forest, where they wanted to take this lodge and right in the middle of some of the best grizzly bear habitat and expand it fourfold and make it an all-season lodge, right in a place that the Forest Service had made a commitment to not do that very thing. That's the kind of thing that really worries me, that we don't have that commitment from the federal land managers, and at the state level we have politicians superseding the decisions of the biologists. Now, we need those two things. We need adequate regulatory mechanisms for mortality, we need adequate habitat management for grizzly bears, and we need enough bears on the landscape to occupy the available habitat for them. Delisting requires more than just the numbers of bears. And we do have the numbers of bears today. We've got over 1,000 grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. But delisting is not dependent on just the numbers of bears. We need those controls on mortality and controls on habitat management, and those things don't exist at this time. So that's why I've changed my mind, and I wrote the first delisting rule. It was litigated in court, and it was Greater Yellowstone Coalition versus Servheen. That's the cited court case. So it's all these law students read that all the time with my name in it. But I was on the other side, but I changed my mind, and that's where I am today. I don't think that we're ready to do this. We're not ready to turn management over to the states at this point, unless we can get the politicians out of the deep day-to-day activities on grizzly bears, and they stop promoting all these risky, dangerous things in the landscape that are going to kill grizzly bears and we won't know about it.
Thanks, Chris. We'll dive into some of those more specifics likely later. Quentin, for you, it's very easy to hear the loud political voices around wildlife management, but you work behind the scenes of wildlife policy. And I'm curious to hear for you, what state management could actually mean if it does happen. There's been a flurry of activity from the state. There's been lawsuits related to delisting. There's been management plans. There's been an online dashboard that you created that monitors where and how every grizzly bear that's been found has passed away. There's the FWP even participated in the relocation of 2 grizzly bears from the glacier area down to the Yellowstone area to promote genetic diversity in this area. And to you, the state of Montana does suggest that it's ready to handle grizzlies, and I'd love to hear about why and what that would actually mean.
Thanks, Nick. And we do believe, the agency does believe that the state of Montana is ready to receive grizzly bears, the recovered populations that are in the NCDE, numerically and distributional objectives, and also the Yellowstone system. Those are the two with petitions in front of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that we anticipate some comment to in late January. I would also say, Nick, that it's often said that in the context of delisting and moving from federal oversight to state management, you lose protections. I would offer that it's better to say that some protections change with state management. It's a species that is conflict. It's conflict prone, and it can be serious circumstances to life, limb, and property when conflict shows up. And it also has a certain fecundity that bears close watching, to Chris's point, mortality, understanding what kind of mortality the population can suffer, and in the context of both listed status and state managed, and stay at recovery levels. So there's a lot of tension that needs to be applied to grizzly bears. The protections that would come, Montana has worked hard to put the protections that would come with grizzly bear management as a piece of grizzly bear management under state management in the brand new plan that for the first time brings two plans together in one. Speaks to how the state very clearly makes an effort to help everybody understand how it will look, it being state management, and how the state will participate in continued grizzly bear management for populations that are not yet recovered. And recovery is still building numbers, building distribution is part of the game. It also answers questions that we've heard for a long, long time. There's a member of this panel tonight that's representing the landowner community. We know livestock conflict is a big deal with something like a grizzly bear. I mean, we've heard questions, how's that going to look? What's that going to happen? We've heard that question from all quarters of society. The legislature, to Chris's point, has spoken to that. It's that kind of a question. It's a profile question. We worked in the 2023 session, this last session, it was Senate Bill 295, Senator Gillespie worked tirelessly to put some definition to that included some discretion for a landowner to take a grizzly bear that's attacking livestock, but also put some bounds on that, a bounds of a quota and a tie to the mortality threshold that the legislature and administrative rule of Montana, you can all go out and look at it, identifies, but it's not the politicians, it's not the legislature that sets that mortality level. That's experienced staff that have been working with grizzly bears and will continue to work with grizzly bears. So we give that discretion, answer that fundamental question, that concern that's been out there, build tolerance for bears, and do it in a way that's committed to keep bears at a recovery level, both in the context of distribution and numbers. Nick.
Thanks so much, Quentin. I want to continue navigating sort of back and forth between the policy stuff and the lived experience stuff. So my next question is for Druska. Quentin, you mentioned the hardships faced by ranchers. Druska, you experienced those hardships. I think lots of folks that live even here in Livingston likely don't know what a depredation means. Depredation meaning, a cow or calf getting eaten, whether it's by a grizzly bear or a wolf or another carnivore. What does that mean for your operation and for you personally? Like, what's at stake here?
So when I made the commitment to raise cattle, for me that came with the responsibility of making sure they have good food, clean water, they're taken care of for sickness, and I'm supposed to protect them from harm. So now that's not as easy to do. And for me, personally, when you lose an animal to a wolf or a bear, I mean, there's heartache, and I'm the type of person who can't just, oh, it happened. I actually have to go live that with the cow or the calf or whatever, and I don't know that's the best way to go about it, but that's me. And so it's really, really hard for me personally, because I feel like I've failed them. If there's actually something that got them, ate them, caused them pain and trauma, I failed. And I don't like to fail. So I have that issue, and then it's just the basic financial cost. So, just roughly some figures. If calves are worth, say, $2,000 when you sell them in the fall, and you come in short $5, do the math. $10,000 is gone from your paycheck for the year. And that's a big loss. And then if you add in genetics and whether or not it was going to be a replacement animal in your herd, and it goes on, and those other costs are added. So I don't know if people understand. I mean, if you picked up your paycheck one day and it was $10,000 short, and you didn't understand how that happened, and then they tell you, but you have to accept it, it's a blow. And we try, so we've been up Trail Creek forever with our cattle. And it was not unusual to come out with 100%. So everything that went in came out. And it's not like that anymore. And we have losses of 3 to 6 or 7 animals. And that's a really big blow, both emotionally to me and the bottom line. And at home, we don't have a problem, really. I mean, the bears are around. We've got mountain lions. I don't think we have wolves at home on the river. But they don't, everybody lives and coexists. But when you leave them up on summer pasture and you can't be with them all the time, it's a different thing.
And Druska, some of the audience might have also heard about the state's compensation program for livestock loss. Can you talk a little bit about how that works for you, if it does work?
So, in theory, it's a great idea. So, you lose an animal, you have somebody come and they say, yep, it was a bear that did this, or yep, it was a wolf that did this, and then you get compensated. The reality of that is you never find them because they eat them so fast. And when animals are out on summer pasture, you're not with them 100% of the time. That's an impossible task. And so they're on the landscape, grazing, doing what they do, and their calf gets eaten by something, and you don't find it, so it just doesn't come home. And you don't know why. So there's reasons. Maybe it got sick, maybe a wolf got it, maybe a bear got it, but something trauma-related happened to that calf. And so, there's programs out there, like the compensation program. If you can't find the first calf, you can't get the ×3 that compensation programs do. So what that means is that they find and say, yes, it was a bear loss, and there's a lot of ×2 in the compensations because they figure if you lost one, you're going to lose more. And so they'll multiply it. A multiplier is added then to the compensation. But you have to find them first, and then you have to get it confirmed. And the reality of finding it just destroys the compensation package, in my opinion, because you just can't. And I would like to see something where if you live and operate in grizzly country, you get a freebie up front. And then you talk about the multiplier after you can actually prove that something was killed. So that in the beginning, you've had some compensation for potential loss, and when that loss happens, if you can't find that calf, you got paid. Some of that's an honor system thing, and I understand that could be abused, but you can't find the dead animal, so you can't get compensated.
Thank you so much, Druska. Now, I want to continue talking about sort of on-the-ground reality of living with grizzly bears. Evan, you've talked about some of the measures you've helped get in place in Gardiner. To what extent do you consider Gardiner a bear-resilient community? And how much work remains to be done to help residents and tourists alike understand what it means to live with bears?
Yeah, I'd say we're certainly bear resilient in that Gardiner is not going anywhere. But as far as being bear proof or living with bears, I think Gardiner has a long ways to go. We're pretty far from being, in my opinion, a bear smart community. Our recent track record kind of shows that. We've had plenty of conflicts this fall. We had kind of a really crazy summer with one particular bear who was causing a lot of problems.
And that bear was breaking into homes, even businesses, right?
Yeah, he did quite a number. And that was a bear that had been around kind of using Gardiner on and off for years. And a bear that I had been watching for years in the park, feeding on winter-killed bison in the spring, which is as kind of good as bear behavior as we can ask for, right, and as far as the natural scheme of things. And then kind of evolving into coming into town for apple trees, and then grease traps, and then trash, until over the course of years this summer, it kind of escalated into some pretty extreme moments. And, I do most of this work just to keep people safe and to keep bears alive. But every once in a while, we kind of run into that bear, like this guy this summer, and I'm glad they were able to remove him and get him out of the population before he hurt someone.
Yeah, thank you. So we've been hearing a lot about bear conflicts, about bears getting into trouble, eating cows, breaking into homes and businesses. But I'm curious, Chris, you spent decades studying bears, interacting with people who lived with bears. How conflict prone are grizzly bears? And what are our main sources of conflicts?
Well, the vast majority of grizzly bears do not get into conflicts with people. And if you look at the number of livestock depredating bears, it's about 2% or less of the population that's involved in livestock conflicts. So it's a very small number. Oftentimes, if a bear gets started doing that, he'll continue. And so you may have several different losses, say on one ranch or adjacent ranches, and it's the same bear. It's not different bears. So once a bear gets started on that, we share the interests of the ranchers. When I say we, the management agencies, we want to get rid of those bears. We don't want bears eating cattle either. And so we're very aggressive at removing those animals when they start killing livestock. So far in the Yellowstone ecosystem, 28 livestock killing bears have been removed this year in the Yellowstone system on the 3 states. And so,
can you put that number in context? We have about 1,000 grizzlies in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. How many mortalities do we see a year? Like what makeup of is 28?
Well, this year, the known mortalities in the Yellowstone ecosystem are 72. Those are human-caused mortalities. And so 28 of those were removals due to livestock conflicts. And in the big picture of things, the vast majority of bears do not get into conflicts with people. And bears that are in and around houses and buildings, they can be more prone to conflicts. Those bears are what we call, they become habituated, they lose their natural avoidance response. And if they get food rewards in association with people, whether it's garbage or livestock feed or something like that, they become food conditioned. And a bear can be food conditioned and not be habituated, so he can come in and eat stuff and be really careful and never seen. He can be habituated and not food conditioned. He just walks around very close to people. You look at the bears in the Lamar Valley, for example. Those bears are very relaxed around people. They're habituated, many of those Yellowstone bears, but they never get human foods. But a bear can both be habituated and food conditioned, and such a bear is removed right away. We almost always remove those bears immediately. And we don't want livestock losses. We don't want bears getting into conflicts with cattle. The latest count that I saw on the Livestock Loss Board in Montana is that 64 cows have been documented to have been killed by grizzly bears in the state of Montana this year. And there may be others that weren't found. But the point is that we don't want those bears doing that, and aggressively, agency-wise, the bear managers go in and capture those bears, and if they're documented to be continual livestock depredators, they're removed. And there's no difference between the state policy and the listed policy. So grizzly bears, whether they're livestock killers, they're removed if they're listed, they're removed if they're not listed. So there's no difference in management policy whether the bears are delisted or not in terms of this conflict with livestock. We don't want those bears doing that. We try to get those bears out of the population. And we're very sympathetic to the ranching communities. We want to help them. We want to go out and reach out to them and provide opportunities for them to minimize these range riders, for example, where we can hire range riders to go out and ride the range, say Trail Creek, to look for dead cattle, dead calves, so that they can be found right away and documented. We want to.
Maybe use my mic. We'll see that. We'll see that for you.
Sorry about that. It wasn't my voice. You know, we want to help the ranchers out, putting range riders out there so that they don't have to be out there looking all the time. That a person is out there looking all the time to find these kills, reporting them, documenting them, and getting those bears out of there. These are things that we can do to help these ranchers. We can remove carcasses. Maybe an animal dies from one cause or another. A carcass in there can draw other bears in. Getting that carcass, that livestock carcass, out of that range area is a way to keep bears out of there too. So we want to help the ranchers. We want to do everything we can to reach out to them and provide tools to minimize the number of conflicts so that they don't have to live on the edge and be nervous.
Quentin, I have a couple questions for you, but first, do you have anything you want to add about how the state approaches conflicts with, how the state approaches or wants to approach conflict, grizzly conflicts with ranchers in particular?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think, Chris, that was all well said. I think, the approach, identifying the issue is the problem there in this case as quickly as possible, having an effective solution applied as quickly as possible. The additional piece that I would talk about that the plan identifies is an additional layer of discretion for the landowner in the event that landowner is seeing that attack in the moment under a quota system that's connected to the mortality threshold, so we don't overdo it. We don't reduce the population through the application of that discretion. Thinking that would be another assistance to that person. Wouldn't remove the agency response from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the agency response from Wildlife Services, if that's where it goes, but it would allow an additional layer of discretion under state management of that sort.
Thanks so much. And I want to shift away from conflicts necessarily to a different aspect of grizzly management, and which I mentioned in passing earlier, which is that the state was involved in relocating 2 bears from the glacier area to the Yellowstone area. People might have heard about this and been like, why are they doing that? What's going on? So can you tell us more about what that initiative, like why it happens, what it means for the grizzly populations, and what's ahead in terms of genetics?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Yeah, so the Yellowstone population in particular has been seen as an isolated population relative to the NCDE. No connection there, no genetic exchange between those two populations. And the NCDE, of course, has connection to a larger bear population in Canada to the north.
And to clarify for the audience, the NCDE is the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem in and around Glacier National Park.
Thank you, Nick. Sorry for that. And so so connectivity has been part of the recovery conversation, has been part of the delisting conversation. Montana has a commitment to that connectivity. Took opportunity with legislative offering both staff and operations to find a good candidate bear and move those 2 bears that you referenced, Nick. It's not an endpoint, it's only putting 2 bears, being active about putting 2 bears into the ecosystem. When we have the opportunity, sooner rather than later, the geneticists tell us that's something that should happen a couple of times every bear generation, some 10, 12, 15 years. And we've got to start on that now. We've got those 2 bears on the ground. Have they been successful in breeding and reproducing? Not yet. It's too early to tell if that will happen, so we don't know if we've achieved that next point, but we're taking a step closer to that next point. Is it an end point? No. There's no suggestion that it's an end point. We look to continue that. We also look to continue our efforts about natural connection, natural connectivity between ecosystems. In this conversation, the NCDE, the Bob Marshall, and the Greater Yellowstone, for those bears that are able to find a way, with our assistance, being bear aware, habitat projects, keep that landscape as permeable as possible to a bear, but also recognizing in the state plan that it's not going to be the densities you see in the core areas. It doesn't need to be the densities that you see in the core areas. We're talking again about a couple of bears every bear generation. So you can arrive at that genetic connectivity with relatively few bears. And we think there's a fit there. Working on bear awareness, helping bears stay out of conflict so that we avoid those choices altogether, if possible. Getting bears into the Yellowstone, accomplish that genetic exchange. maintaining both tools, both options. One has a certainty to it. One is every year a work in progress. And we think we're going to get there eventually. I think we're close, 35 miles when you look at bear observations, one ecosystem to the other. So I think it's going to happen. We're going to continue to chase that. Both pursuits, Nick.
Thanks, Quentin. We've talked a lot about conflict so far. I'm curious from you, Evan. We've heard that the vast majority of bears don't get into conflicts. We certainly do have problem bears. You've instituted all kinds of efforts in Gardiner to try to help people and bears coexist. Tell us more about what kind of things we can do to be more bear aware, to coexist better with bears, and how fundamentally can we?
Yeah, I think it's definitely very achievable. There's some communities in Canada that are doing a very, very impressive job in the way they manage bears in close proximity to humans in towns. I find bear-proofing your property or your business or your town or whatever it may be outside of the ranching, that's a whole another set of variables and tasks that are pretty hard. But for a town like Gardiner, it's pretty simple. I find it pretty simple. I find bears, at least the ones that I'm dealing with coming into Gardiner, are pretty predictable. They're coming down and they're looking for food. They're looking for any of those attractants, and it's a pretty wide array of what those attractants might be, but there's a lot of different ways to secure them, putting them inside your house, putting them in bear-proof containers, moving them away to the dump, right, which our dump down in our Greenbuck site in Gardiner is bear-proof, which is great. Electric fencing, there's a number of things we can do. It's just the hardest part to accomplish that is not necessarily dealing with that individual bear who's learned that there's food in downtown Gardiner. It's dealing with the humans whose job it is to put that trash away, or whose responsibility it is to put that electric fence up, or to honestly just reach out and ask for help, right? The bears are kind of the easy part of the equation, in my opinion.
Now you mentioned that the world of ranching is a whole different world for coexistence. Druska, I think some folks, even in the know of grizzly coexistence, might think like, oh, why don't you just put up electric fence? Why don't you just hire a range rider? Why don't you just get guardian dogs or all these things? What does coexistence mean to you? And from your perspective, what resources are necessary to be able to coexist with grizzly bears as a rancher?
So we did have a range rider this summer up Trail Creek. I'm not going to say it didn't work, but it's possible that we should have had that presence more often. That whole thing's a work in progress. So did it work this year? So what do we do next year? I'm not ready to give up on it, but we did have a range rider this year. At home, so every single ranch I know has what we call a bone pile. So in the dead of winter, when you're calving and you lose a calf, or a cow dies because her uterine artery ruptured and you couldn't save them, we don't have a backhoe. The ground's frozen. And so for every rancher that is losing animals during calving time, you have a bone pile. And we got into a bind with our bone pile last spring. And it became an attractant. We didn't want it to be. It happened so fast that you couldn't do anything about it because the bears had already found it. So the best you could hope for is that they would just finish it and leave. And the Paradise Valley Working Lands Group is a group of ranchers in the valley that we meet, we try and come up with solutions to issues. And we've been talking about carcass removal for a year. And other counties, Madison and other areas of the state, have pretty robust carcass removal systems, and they compost and do all kinds of stuff. The Paradise Valley is pretty small, and everybody's kind of squeezed in there. So composting is a little bit tricky. I think ranch biosecurity is a big issue because you can end up passing disease by carting carcasses around. And then, yay for Paradise Valley, we're in the designated surveillance area and you have brucellosis. So all of those factors have come into play now, and the Paradise Valley Working Lands Group, with help from the bear experts with FWP, have decided that one of the best things that we could do is fence our bone piles and put a high-powered solar charger on it, and that's going to take care of the bear one, to have your bone pile. And it works, and they were very responsive, and we have 2 bone piles that are now fenced.
Thank you. You mentioned, FWP's bear experts. Quentin, could you talk a little bit about that program? So FWP employs a number of bear experts and focused on coexistence, and you continue to hire more. Can you tell us about that program, why it exists, and the successes and challenges it has?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Yes, it is, and there's two manifestations of that capacity. One is the bear conflict specialist that works proactively, like Druska just referenced, to prevent conflict from happening, and that same person also works in response to conflict when it's realized. Assists USDA Wildlife Service if the conflict is a livestock loss. We take the lead if it's a human safety or human injury, human fatality circumstance. And so those folks understand bear behavior. We count them, we have a lot of good staff, and to be very clear, they are some of them. There's another manifestation of that work group, and that is those persons that are focused on outreach. So not working directly with responding to a bear, trapping a bear. They might put up an electric fence, there's some overlap there, and they are dedicated entirely to prevention, conflict prevention. Everything from helping community efforts that have already been addressed here, talking about apple trees and hummingbird feeders and helping people first understand that that's an attractant. That surprises a lot of folks. To working with hardware electric fence at the community scale, at the individual ranch scale, at the recreational group scale, and we have been working hard to keep up with the front edge of the growing distribution of grizzly bears. Working still with those that have been with grizzly bears for a long time. There's always new folks, there's always new circumstances, but really with a focus on a couple of things. Where grizzly bears, to some of your comments at the beginning, Nick, are brand new and something that folks haven't been thinking about, haven't been prepared for. Certainly prioritizing those. Also prioritizing some of the, we talked earlier about connectivity between populations. Prioritizing their efforts where we anticipate bears to move between ecosystems, between core areas. Again, those bears are important as bears, as numbers, also an ambassador from one population to another population. So we also guide them with those maps, those temperature maps that some of you may see.
Thank you so much. My next question is for you, Chris, and it's a question that I think might engender a lot of passion among a lot of people, because when it comes to delisting grizzly bears, one issue in particular gets a lot of attention, which is hunting. If we were to drive down the valley a few months ago, there are billboards about no delisting, no trophy hunting. Chris, you being on all sides of the delisting things, you've thought a lot about what a hunting season could mean for grizzly bears. Can you break down a little bit about why to you there should or should not be a grizzly hunt, and some of the sort of maybe misconceptions about what a hunt might mean for grizzlies?
Well, first of all, hunting is the hot button issue when you talk about delisting grizzly bears. So if you want to get people's emotions going, just use the word hunt. First of all, you don't need to hunt grizzly bears to manage them. So hunting is in no way necessary for management of grizzly bears. British Columbia eliminated their hunt about 6 years ago. They have 14,000 grizzly bears in British Columbia, and they don't sport hunt them. They don't need to. Hunting will not reduce human-bear conflicts. There's good literature that shows that hunting does not do that. Hunting will not reduce human fatalities due to grizzly bear attacks. Those are random events that cannot be controlled in any way by hunting. And a sport hunt is not going to change the density or distribution of grizzly bears to any great extent at all. So it's not going to somehow balance the state of how many bears can live in the environment. So hunting is something that's desired by a certain portion of the population. And could we have a hunt of grizzly bears yes, we could have a hunt of grizzly bears in any ecosystem. If that hunt took place, it would be a very small number of bears. It might only be 6 or 8 bears in any one year. And look at what we've had so far. We have 72 known mortalities.
Might be weird. Just keep pushing them around. We'll see if it works.
We have 72 mortalities in the Yellowstone system. If we add hunting to that, then it's going to be fairly small numbers. And every year we're going to have a lot of bears that are removed from all different reasons. Conflicts, hit by cars like 399 was, illegal kills, mistaken identity kills, self-defense kills. All those things are going to occur. The numbers of bears that would be left for any trophy hunt is going to be pretty small. And the amount of fighting and effort that goes into hunting is, in my view, really not worth it for the future of grizzly bears. If we want to talk about the future of grizzly bears, do we have to fight about hunting for the 5, 6, 8 bears that might be taken in a sport hunt? I'm not against hunting. I'm a hunter, but I don't think that a lot of people are very positive about trophy hunting an animal. People don't shoot grizzly bears to eat them like they shoot elk. So it's a trophy hunt. As you know what a trophy hunt is. You're shooting the animal for its hide and for its skull and that kind of thing. And there's a pretty low tolerance of that kind of thing in the American public. About 4% of the American public hunts big game animals. And the numbers of hunters every year are declining in the United States. And the idea of hunting an animal that's iconic like grizzly bear really raises a lot of ire and angst in the public that doesn't hunt. And on top of that, it's important to recognize that all the tribes that I have talked to in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and before I retired in 2016, I went to every tribal council in the system. Unanimously, they were opposed to hunting. And they don't believe that it's right for white people to kill a spiritual animal like grizzly bears for fun. That's their take on it. And they're very eloquent in their feeling on that. And I think we need to respect that. But that said, could we hunt a certain number of grizzly bears and not decline the population? Yes. It would be a very, very limited number, but it could be done. And the question is whether society is willing to accept that. British Columbia stopped hunting because over 90% of the population of British Columbia was opposed to trophy hunting grizzly bears, and so they stopped. So it's a hot button issue, a lot of emotion. It's probably the number one emotion issue when you talk about grizzly bears is trophy hunting.
Absolutely. And Quentin, the state, discusses hunting a great deal in this management plan, and has certainly been thinking about hunting grizzly bears. But the state's also taking a very interesting approach, which is the state will not hold a hunt for at least 5 years after delisting. And to clarify for the audience, Endangered Species Act protections for the grizzly bear mean a ban on hunting. So if it's delisted, a hunting season is possible where the species exists. Can you tell us more about the state's approach to hunting and why it's taking that approach?
Thank you, Nick. And if I may, I'd like to offer what I would count as friendly amendments to the base that Chris put in place. I think all of that was well said. We have an administrative rule of Montana. That's the product of a formal public engagement process that's overseen by the Secretary of State. That's the entity that hosts the repository for administrative rule of Montana. There's a new administrative rule of Montana out there that, with the force of law, says that the department cannot propose a hunt for at least 5 years for any population that's delisted. Why is that? So we're not racing to a hunt. That's the 5-year post-delisting monitoring period. We understand the service is going to be looking at the state of Montana to see how state management actually manifests itself. We also understand that a lot of the public, if not all of the public, is going to be looking closely to see how we do it. We see a gradual approach, a stepwise approach, and whatever else that means, it means exploring the mortality that we realize at an annual increment with the new discretion that state management would allow. Again, for example, the landowner having the discretion to take the grizzly bear that's attacking livestock under a quota. So first, taking the good time to understand how much of the discretionary mortality on this safe side of the allowed mortality to keep that would keep the population listed, that would keep the population recovered. What's that look like? And it may well be that it takes most of the discretionary mortality, maybe for one gender, maybe for one age class, such that we can't entertain a hunt because we either don't have that discretion available, because our first priority is making sure we address conflict, or it's a really small number. So that's, again, we want to walk this road slow and steady and deliberately. There's another delisted species that the state took that approach, and we think it worked well. We want to make sure the public comes along with us. We want to make sure we answer questions. We want to make sure we take the time, not just to do this, but to do it well. So again, the ARM rule says the department will not propose a hunt for at least 5 years. I would add one more quick thing. We do think, again, Chris said that the population, assuming that the mortality discretion is there, could host a hunt. We agree with that. We do think that perhaps there's some specific circumstances where a hunt might not necessarily prevent conflict, but might be a response to conflict. The last iteration of a hunt in Montana actually took that model where we tried to connect a hunter with a bear that had been characterized as an issue, as a problem bear. And we also don't dismiss the potential at local scales for targeted grizzly bear harvest to help influence distribution.
Thank you, Quentin. So we have about a half hour left of this conversation, and I have a million more questions for all of you. But I also want to make sure that we have room for audience questions. So for the next little bit, I'd love to hear from you. Put your hand up, and I'll bring the microphone to you. I'm going to start in the back and work my way forward, just for not running around so much. Let's go back here. All right. Tell us your name and where you're from.
My name is Paul. I live here, and my question is for Quentin. You mentioned a couple of times the fact that some of the policy might include the idea that a landowner would be able to hunt for a bear in a way that they would perhaps be protecting the bear or protecting their cattle. Is there a lot of evidence to show that that would be effective? Do you have a lot of data on that? And also, are there discretionary measures in place to make sure that doesn't get abused?
Yeah, Nick, Paul, right?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Paul, for the question. If I might stand, Nick.
Go for it.
Yeah, so just to be clear on what I was talking about, and the discretion I was talking about was, and it's identified in statute, and that is also clarified additionally in Administrative Rule of Montana. And what the discretion is, the commission would set a quota. The quota would be informed by staff that whatever else they present to the commission in that moment, they're going to present the mortality that's available that the population could withstand and still maintain recovery levels. That quota then is available for application for a landowner that experiences, sees, encounters a grizzly bear literally in the act of attacking livestock. In that moment, that person could take that bear. Now, maybe he takes the bear and the livestock is still lost. Maybe he takes the bear and then the animal's only wounded and recovered. Maybe he takes the bear and there aren't any subsequent depredations from that bear on cattle. So that's the utility that we look for. If a person goes over the quota, can't do that. It's like any other quota managed with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Once the quota is met, that discretion is closed down. I'll stop there, Paul, to see if I've answered the question.
Sure. Yeah, I just have to also comment that seems to contradict with what Druska is saying, that most of the time they can't even find the cattle.
Nick, Paul, great point. Yeah, so it comes the question a little bit, maybe stated a little differently, or I might respond to capture that question is, so how much do we expect? And that circumstance doesn't appear often. That is our first impression. And so we don't look for this to be a big number. That's not to say it's not an important option, that should the landowner find themselves in that circumstance, that it's there to apply. We see that with something called Senate Bill 200 for wolves. It's a similar thing, it's different, but it's a similar approach, it's a similar capacity, it's a similar discretion in that same sort of moment. And we find that statewide and at an annual level, very finite numbers. But when you talk with the landowner community that's worried about that circumstance, is a valuable tool in the toolbox. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. All right, I think we have one more back here. Let's go over here.
Hi, my question's for Quentin too. My name's Katie, I live in Livingston. You mentioned quotas are an important part of the state management plan. However, with wolves, we've seen that quotas aren't always respected. About a month ago, Unit 3135 wolves were killed when the quota was 3. So if bear management is taken over by the state, how would you ensure that the quota is maintained and respected?
That's a great point. Katie, is that correct? Yeah, thank you, Katie. My first response is a little clarification on quota. The quota, the commission sets a quota. They exist for things like wolves, things like mountain lions. In some places we have them for elk, where we can check that harvest through a check station. And the quota is a commission adoption, and the department initiates a closure upon the quota being met. There's an element of required public notice that means we can't do that in real time. And until that notice of closure is visible to the public, it's not closed. That's how quotas have run since they have begun. It very often misses a lot of public expectation, but there's nothing new in that moment. In the case of grizzly bears, and certainly in the case of wolves, no decision by the commission to the point of harvest is less than a year away from being revisited. So those situations, sometimes the quota is 3 and the harvest is 3. Sometimes the quota is 3 and the harvest is 2. Sometimes the quota is 3 and the harvest is 5. All of that's plainly visible to the commission in the next cycle of setting the quota. Whether they think that additional harvest beyond the quota warrants some restriction, some more conservative approach to the subsequent year or not. Does that end? So it's a bit about mechanics of how that quota. It's a tool been around for a long, long time. We point to its success. We recognize that it often misses some public expectations of how they first perceive it to operate. Hope that helps, Katie.
Thank you very much. Questions for Quentin are wonderful and welcome, but I also want to make sure that all our panelists are getting some questions. So let's take another one for a different panelist here. Perfect.
Hi, my name's Kara. I live in Gardiner. Druska, with all that sort of context that was just explained by Quentin, do you, as a rancher, feel like that's does that give you any reassurance? Is that useful to you? Like, what are your thoughts about that? And also, do you see it as something that could be maybe misutilized by some landowners?
I think the chances of finding a grizzly bear in the act of killing one of our calves is so minuscule that it's not going to happen. That being said, 3 days after we saw the grizzly bear, there were grizzly bear tracks, multiple bears, in the driveway, and on top of that were mountain lion tracks. So if it's a person that bear is going after, that's all, and it's real time, you bet. I think it's a tool and you use it. But when you're talking about cattle in a pasture, far away from the house, or clear up in the mountains, I think the chances of actually seeing it happening are very, very small. And, most of us don't carry guns. So if you don't have your gun with you at the exact moment you see that, it's not happening. So it's a tool, and maybe if you have repeat offenses and you've decided you're packing that gun all the time and you're going to spend more time out on the landscape, maybe you run into that situation. But for the most part, I don't think it's going to be a tool that gets used often and therefore not abused.
Does that answer your question? Yeah, wonderful. All right, other questions? Other folks? All right, up front.
I'm Ted. I'm kind of new to this area, so you might have all different answers to this, but I'm a numbers guy, so when you talk about 1,000 grizzlies in the ecosystem, a loss of 70, 80 a year to the different causes, either removals or hunters, or, hunter interactions or self-defense. What is the number you want? What is the prime number for recovery that would either allow delisting or keep us away from delisting?
Chris, let's start with you.
Chris, can I add as an add-on? I'm Cara. I live here in Livingston too. I'm related to him. Give us a little bear biology, like how long does it take a bear to reach sexual reproduction, and how many cubs are born a year in the ecosystem, that kind of thing, to understand the balance of numbers.
Okay. The number 1,000, 1,100 bears comes from the monitoring and what's called the demographic monitoring area, which is but a subset of the area that bears are in the system. So there are bears outside that system that don't get counted in that 1,000, 1,100 bears. The average female starts reproducing at age 5 and reproduces every 3 years. She lives probably 18 years, and so she probably, she takes at least 10 to 15 years to replace herself with a female cub that survives to adulthood. How many bears do we need on the landscape? There's no magic number. We don't know what the carrying capacity of the system is. That's the great holy grail of wildlife biology. How many do you want?
Yeah.
Exactly how many do you want?
I was just interested in your four different answers, maybe.
Yeah, well, what we want is the population to be healthy. We want them to be to the point that they occupy all the available habitat for them. We know from the work of the scientists that grizzly bears are what are called density-dependent regulators. Okay, so as the population increases in density, which it has done in the Yellowstone system, the subadult survival starts to drop. Cub production starts to drop, and the population growth starts to flatten out. So the population in the Yellowstone system is in that demographic monitoring area is pretty stable. It hasn't changed much at all in probably 8 to 10 years. It's about that number. Because their density-dependent regulation going on. There's so many adult males that subadults, particularly subadult males, are really nervous. It's a very special place to be, a subadult male, because you're always worried. And those adult males will kill cubs, they will kill subadult males in particular, and the population is pretty much regulating itself. That's what grizzly bear populations do. So we don't have a magic number. We know when they start getting to density-dependent regulation, as they are now, that they're pretty much full in the demographic monitoring.
So they are near that density.
And they're not increasing much at all in that demographic monitoring area.
Chris, can you break down a little more? This is off. Hold on. Chris, can you break down a little more what the demographic monitoring area is and where it is, and then what's happening outside of it? Like, how does that fit in?
So it's about 20,000 square miles. Yellowstone Park is like 3,300 square miles, to give you an idea. So it is.
No, mine's worse. Chris gonna keep saying.
It's aliens, they're shutting down our electrical system. So I'm not sure if it's working or not.
Okay. What in the world? Troubles. Oh, here we go. I see what's going on.
It's about 20,000 square miles, and Yellowstone Park is 3,300 square miles. Gives you an idea how big it is. It extends way out beyond the size of Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park. And it's the area that is monitored regularly by the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. That's the area they count bears in. But there are bears outside there that are not counted because they can't count them everywhere because it's just too much work.
Is the microphone working? No, it's not. What in the world?
This one work?
Well, we can talk. We can just talk loudly to make it function. Other questions while I'm dealing with the microphone? Talk very loudly. Let's go here.
Hey, I'm Casey Anderson. I live down here in the valley. First off, thanks everybody for coming up here and sharing your wisdom and your insight, your bravery. It's kind of a question anybody think you can answer it. I'm fairly confident if we went down and locked the door and give you guys a sheet of paper and a pen, we could probably figure out the plan moving forward within a couple hours. But it seems to me that as soon as politics and emotion, and Chris kind of nodded his head to this, gets involved, things start getting ugly and nothing gets figured out. What can we do to ensure that wildlife policy moving forward is based on non-emotion, no politicians involved, science? What can we do?
Good luck.
Yeah. Testify at the legislature, that's what I'd say. I mean, that's what we do, the Montana Wildlife Federation. We go and say, that's not true and that's not right, but they never listen. So, I think testifying is really important and speaking up because a lot of these decisions are made in committee meetings at the legislature. And it's really scary, the things that are stated by many of these folks, and you know, it's frustrating because many times they don't listen to what we provide. We provide detailed information and facts as to why that's not true, and they go right by it and do it anyway. But it's really frustrating, and that's why I'm against delisting, because those are the people that are making these decisions now. They're coming up with new laws, and the worry I have, and many of us have, is that they're going to do to grizzly bears what they're currently trying to do to wolves. And they're trying to knock the wolf population down to 450 in Montana, which is less than 50% of what we've got. And in Idaho, there's 1,500 wolves, and they want to drop that population to 150. And that comes from the legislators and the politicians in those two states. That's really scary. And if those people are in charge without the Endangered Species Act limiting what they can do, then that, you could just imagine what they would be doing. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see.
I have an answer too for Casey. And I think he already, actually I know he already knows this, but to echo what Chris just said, just getting involved, right? There's a problem when politics get involved in the decision making, but the even bigger problem is when the politicians are making decisions that don't align with the constituents' wants. Right, that's where the real problem is. And so holding them accountable, getting involved in, like for everybody here, we're sitting in the middle of Region 3, get to know your Region 3 commissioner. And going to that commission meeting is good, but getting to know her away from that commission meeting and have those conversations a month or 2 months or 6 months before that meeting where you have your 2 minutes, which you're probably going to get cut off because you're nervous and on Zoom and in front of everybody. Like, just avoid that altogether and start that progress way, way before you have 2 minutes at the meeting.
Get involved. Speak up.
Other folks?
I would just say, Chris, I have to put something alongside some of your comments.
It looks like it's working.
I would certainly say again to be involved. It all only works when there's an informed constituency. That's what's brought Montana and its natural resources to 2024, and that's what's going to move Montana forward in that really rich conservation story. I would say that when you look close, there is an abundance of response, of hearing to the public by the decision makers. And you look at some of those, a great way to see that is to look at the first iteration of a particular bill or the first iteration of a commission proposal, and it's not uncommon to see a second, third, or fourth, or fifth iteration that reflects some input that they've heard. So, Chris, you said never. And they do listen. So it's worth getting involved. If you're going to get involved, looking for everything to go your way, you're probably setting yourself up. It's a diversity of input, high values, laden with values, with opinions. And so I would also encourage you to come in with an expectation. Choose what is the piece that you want most to achieve. Focus on that, because nobody's going to get everything they want. Thank you.
Thank you. And to step outside my moderator role a little bit at least, I want to say that this event is in part an attempt at starting to answer that question. Like, we need to talk with each other more. We need to to engage with our own communities and about how we collectively feel about this. It's very rare to get people who disagree about this stuff in a room, and even more rare to get them talking cordially and empathetically with each other and sharing that with the broader community. So I think, to me, this is one step in what we do to find consensus, is have more conversations like this one. You know, Druska, I've even heard you talking in the past about the need for more community dialogue about these issues. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
So you said the word consensus.
No such thing.
And I believe in collaboration. Consensus for me, in order for it to work, you have to be meeting as equals to begin with. So you're apples to apples. And in my experience in all of the issues surrounding ranching and the greater Yellowstone area, most of the people are fighting for a vision or an ideal. I'm fighting for my livelihood, and that's not apples to apples. So I am not a believer in consensus. I do think that you have to show up, you have to say what you think, You have to be involved. All of those things are incredibly important. And then you have to be able to listen. And that's where collaboration comes. And you won't always get your way. It's happened a lot. But consensus for me is not a word.
That's great.
That a girl.
Other thoughts on, I think this is a really wonderful question. Other thoughts from anybody? No? Other questions?
I got a question, Nick.
Yeah.
Do any of you have questions for the other panelists that you want to ask?
If you didn't hear, the question was, do any of the panelists have questions for each other? The microphone's still not working.
Speaking to bear awareness, the more conversations I am in on the topic of grizzly bears, the one common piece, one of the pieces that seems to most commonly get appreciated in an expressed way is preventing conflict, making room for bears to be on the landscape, keeping them out of trouble. And that really speaks loudly to bear awareness. So I'd ask someone from the private sector, as you do that and as you see the agency alongside of you or not alongside of you, are there some things that you could envision the agency doing more or better or differently to further assist you in your approach to individuals and communities to make the landscape more available to grizzly bears by keeping them out of trouble?
Can you repeat the question? Is the mic's not?
I can say it louder, yeah. So the question is really, what can the state do better to help assist folks like Evan, who are working to help communities coexist with bears?
Yeah. Thank you for that, Quentin. And I have an answer. I don't know if you'll like it. So I work very closely with Jeremiah, our Region 3 bear spec down here, who's awesome and an incredible asset to all of us in Region 3. I'd like 4 more of him, please. The reality is Region 3 is massive. It's Big Sky, it's Bozeman, it's Livingston, it's Gardiner, it's Cook City, and beyond. And we have one guy who's in charge of every time a bear sticks his nose in a trash can, trying to sort that out. And so he could get a call of a bear in town in Cook City while there's a hunter who just had an altercation in the Absarokas up here by Livingston, and there's 3 black bears in someone's garage in Big Sky. And that's all going on the same day. And he has to triage that. And it's the NGOs on the ground that he calls and says, hey, I have to go to Big Sky. Can you get over there and set up that fence or drop off that bear can? And so in the name of conservation of grizzlies, and especially I think Jeremiah is in a little bit of a unique position because of our density of bears in Region 3 is pretty incredible. And the geography of it makes it kind of inaccessible from place to place at times. I would love to see, one, more folks like Jeremiah on the ground doing his work and supporting him. And 2, a real heavy focus on those areas of connectivity in those communities, that 35-mile distance in between. Trying to bear-proof Gardiner, who's been dealing with bears forever. Even when we were at really low populations, there were bears around Gardiner. And if we can't figure out in Gardiner, how do we expect a community who hasn't seen a bear in 150 years to figure it out? And so being ahead of the ball like that, and with the state taking the lead, I'd be pretty happy about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Understood.
I'd be happy.
Other questions from the audience? Let's go, over here.
I have a question for Chris. If trophy hunting ever happened in Montana for grizzly bears, what would be the monetary value of that hunt to an outfitter? Can you estimate that?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. It would be a lot, tens of thousands of dollars, I'm sure. I mean, in British Columbia, when they used to hunt, it was $10,000 to $20,000 for an outfitter to take somebody out. In BC, it'd probably be the same here, I would imagine. But it's a wild guess on my part. I don't know. Maybe Quentin's got a better idea.
What's your wild guess?
$10,000 to $20,000. I'm just guessing.
Isn't that what an elk hunt costs?
Yeah, I'm just guessing. I don't know what it would be. I can't imagine what it would be. It would be a lot of money. Put it that way.
Yeah, Quentin, do you have other thoughts on that?
I would just say it's that order of magnitude. Yeah, it's tens of thousands. I would expect.
over here.
Yeah, there's just a question about economics of resources. I live across the street from Jeremiah, so I understand everything you just explained. Having 4, 5, 6, 10 Jeremiahs, it would clearly make everybody happy, but where's the budget for something like that? That could actually shift in that direction. What are the concerns of moving forward with costs? Because I know that people in these fields, they're not paid extremely well as it currently is. How do you even assess that from available resources now, in the past, and the future?
And can I add to that question a little bit as well? If bears are delisted, does that come with a concurrent loss in federal funding for this kind of work? Yeah.
It does. In the case of Montana, a significant of the daily operations and the daily personnel are already in the state's lab. The answer to your question, really, I hear your question is who decides the budget and who decides the number of FTE. That's a legislative decision, always has been. The role that we would play would making a business case connection to any request for resources, as were articulated earlier. And the role that you would play is, tracking that conversation, and where you saw a business case ask of dollars or FTE or equipment or both or all three that you wanted to support, your role would be visiting with those decision makers.
Yeah. Other questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, so kind of going back to the economic value of the hunts again, well, I guess with trophy hunting in general, so we have the wolf hunt right now, and then the grizzly hunt would be a potential. Right now, to get a wolf tag in Montana, it costs like $12 or $10, something like that, so it's a very low monetary value. Would the state consider potentially raising that tag cost quite a bit so that it could fund other efforts for the coexistence, the expansion of Grizzlies, everything that we're kind of talking about here in terms of helping the recovery effort should kind of be funded by if there is a trophy hunt put in place, rather than that just being basically free for people to take part in.
Thank Nick, I'll take a stab. Great question, thank you. And the reality is that most of the species that have a licensure requirement, the revenue that most of them generate are not enough to really move the needle if you dedicated just those dollars to their management. Legislature does set license prices. That's where that conversation and decision comes from. What's already on the books, and it's been there for a long while, some of you may know something a little different, but along the same lines, is the legislature has identified the potential to auction a single grizzly bear license. You see that with, for example, bighorn sheep, and that goes to a venue. The commission solicits interest from an outside party to host that auction, to host that lottery. And in the case of bighorn sheep and with other species, a growing interest reflected in a growing income. And then that same statute dedicates those revenues to that species and its management.
And to inform,
so some of that,
and to inform that the scale that we're talking about here, to give like the bighorn example, can you tell the audience like the sums of money we're talking about that can go for?
Yeah, bighorn sheep is the one that has generated the most, and it, in recent times, routinely is something north of $300,000.
I might add too, we're also here in Park County, and I recognize that this is unique to Park County, but there's a $500 million tourism economy here, which in large part is driven by our neighbor down south, right, Yellowstone Park, in which there are a lot of companies like my own that generate a lot of revenue and pay in a kind of roundabout way. A little bit of that money does get back to FWP through a bed tax and different things. Has FWP ever thought about or looked into the opportunity of pulling a tax from the tourism industry specifically for wildlife conservation efforts based on these businesses that are bringing in all this money?
Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has not looked at that. We see that we see that not as our primary role to go looking for those kind of dollars through that sort of mechanism. We understand that there are on occasion conversations about that potential, just as you have raised here. But to your question, has that been a deliberate focus on our part? No, it has not.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. Like, this is a question that faces a lot of wildlife management as Chris mentioned, hunting declines. So much of our traditional conservation dollars comes from hunting. And we've seen exponential increases in recreation, and that recreation does not contribute to conservation in the same way necessarily. So looking ahead, there is potentially room for experimenting, whether here or elsewhere in the country, about how to fund conservation and wildlife in a world that looks a lot different than it did 100 odd years ago, when the way we conceived of conservation now was initiated. Yeah. Other questions? Mark?
For Chris, it's obvious you wear some deep scars from the legislative process you've been involved with, but I can't help but think that it's a natural, albeit slow evolution to a counterweight for the litigation put up by narrowly focused groups trying to do the same thing on the other end of the spectrum of setting policies, numbers, and that sort of thing, those things decided in the courts rather than at the agency level or at the legislative level. Is that something that you would agree with or not?
Well, the courts have intervened on some issues. For example, the Fish, Wildlife and Parks was taken to court by some groups that said you shouldn't be trapping wolves while grizzly bears are still out, because the commission said they could trap wolves in places that grizzly bears were when they were still out of their dens. That was litigated. That was, a federal judge said they couldn't do that anymore. Fish, Wildlife and Parks couldn't trap wolves when grizzly bears were out and could only trap during the time that grizzly bears were in their dens. That was a litigated issue. It was something that we testified to that effect in front of the legislature and in front of the commission and were ignored. Those groups took it to court and they won in federal court. I guess is that the clarification or the question you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, even in a broader sense, I think so many things early on, say like for instance in the wolf reintroduction, so many of those thresholds were bumped up over the years through the courts. And that's what I'm getting at is it just seems to be a counterweight, a countermeasure, an evolutionary process of, okay, well, if this particular cross-section of folks are going to go through the court system to get what they want, then there's certain groups or certain ways to get people elected that will counterweight that, will counter that. That's what I see. I mean, it seems like a natural evolution of that to me.
I can't hear too
well. Yeah, I'm just not sure how to answer that. That's kind of a convoluted question. I'm not really criticizing you, but it's really complicated.
Yeah, I just was wondering if you had considered that other end of it.
Yeah, I'm just not sure how to respond to that. I'm not sure. Do you want to? Right.
So, I think we live in a time of extremes. And we see that in conservation, and especially with the animals. People are passionate in their beliefs. And we don't listen very well to one another. And I think that what Mark's trying to say is that, we as a group that live here, make our, homes here, raise our kids here, we can't agree on a solution or a way to move. So then the extremists come in on the other ends in the courts, and it gets decided there when we could have had more say in what happened to us, and we gave that up. Did that get kind of close?
That's a really good answer. I mean, we tried to get the legislature and the commission not to authorize wolf trapping when grizzly bears were still out. And me, presented testimony along with all the data graphs about when the bears are in and when they're out, presented them all this stuff, and they just ignored it. And so these groups had a great avenue to take them to court and win. And, you know, it's unfortunate. It could have been solved locally if they would have said, yeah, that's a common sense view. We want to be able to trap wolves, but let's do it when the bears aren't out. And so they could have had no court case, but they chose to go the other way, and
Well,
that's the end result.
As a
just out of
group-
respect, or go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
as a group, would you have had more influence if your constituents were with you and it was a more united front on whatever you're asking? So my point is that either end is not going to get us what we want. And it's going to end up causing more division, and at the end of the day, it divides communities. And I think if anything is important out of tonight, is that we learn how not to be divided. There has got to be places where we can agree, and places where we don't, we should at least talk and listen about it. Because people's passions are not going to go away, and we have to respect that.
Thank you so much, Druska. I think, let me check the time, but I think we're already well over time. It's 7:42. So I do want to respect everybody here's time. And that, to me, that is just a perfect note to end on. That we need to listen to Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Josh Burnham from Montana Public Radio, to MTPR, to the University of Montana School of Journalism, who supported the podcast, The Wide Open, which I encourage you all to listen to if you haven't, to interviewees like Mark Rose, who are here tonight, and to all of you for coming. This is just a terrific event. And of course to PCEC, Park County Environmental Council, and in particular Carrie and Max, who helped put this event on, and to the 1900 for sharing this amazing space with us all. I think, you know, this conversation, as I see it, is a starting point. These issues are not going anywhere. They will only get louder in the months to come. And so I hope we can continue to engage and more than anything to listen to one another about what this all means for us in our community here. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.